Sa kuulad AIPowerment podcasti, Eesti esimest AI teemadele keskenduvat taskuhäälingut, mis aitab muuta tehisintellekti maailma arusaadavaks ja kättesaadavaks igale kuulajale.
Igal reedel toome sinuni olulised AI arengud, kasulikud tööriistad ning inspireerivad kogemuslood.
Me tehis arutame inimestega, kes rakendavad AI't päriselt nii töös kui ka igapäevaelus.
Mina olen Kerlin Tigemäe, tehisintellekti koolitaja ja finantsvaldkonna praktik.
Ja mina olen Sandra Reivik, ettevõtja, AI koolitaja ja AIPowermenti looja. AI, ning head kuulamist. Hi everyone. As introduced, we are from the AIPowerment podcast, #1 podcast here in Estonian. Yeah, and we are going to be talking about today the global AI race. That's going to be one of the themes. We're going to go then into the future of work. And then thirdly, we're going to also discover what could be our competitive advantage as Estonia in this global AI race. And here we do have brilliant minds, two lovely gentlemen, Taavi Tammiste, who has co-founded the company called Fyma. And he's currently a trusted advisor for many companies building with AI. And Luukas-Kristjan Ilves, who is the former government chief information officer and currently advising the Ukraine's deputy Prime Minister on AI-driven digital transformation. And I will go off, and Kerlin, of course, also here with me as a co-host. And we will start off by giving you a short 1 minute for introductions and maybe one icebreaker as well to tell us about the last time an AI system genuinely surprised you or scared you. I give you the word, Taavi, to you.
Sure. Well, intro, yeah, you already said, so helping currently companies to build AI applications, maybe go into directly when AI has surprised me. I mean, these days it's quite often. I remember a time where it was like maybe once a year, now it's almost every day. I'm usually not surprised by tech that much, but these days, if you look at even like open source models. This morning, I saw an application that was built by the Chinese Gwen 2.5 model that blew my mind away because it was hosted on a cell phone, basically. So the speed that things are really increasing is impressive. But also, I just came back from the States, and one thing that also really surprised me is the difference in attitude between Europe and the States, where I think, at least from a sea level, things are very different in a sense that there everybody is looking for opportunities to use it, where here in Estonia, in our region, I very often find that companies are still finding ways to store data instead of use data. So yeah, that was a maybe not so good surprise, but a surprise nonetheless.
Yeah, and definitely we're going to go into the experience that you had in US and bring in the fresh perspective from there. Lukas.
So the last time I really had a wow moment was when the full version of O3 came out, which was, I guess, earlier this year, just because the complexity of the thought and the systematization, Gemini and some others have caught up now, really was a step change. I'll also add a time recently that AI disappointed me, just this week. I wanted to do something pretty simple, to take a recording of a talk I gave, to take my slides, which were images, and to put the slides in the right place in the transcript so that I'd have a document with the slides and the text to go with it. And both O3 and Gemini and Grok, they all said, that's nice, it's too hard, I can't do it, find a person to do it. And then they explained to me why it's too hard. And I was like, this shouldn't be that hard, that like, given what these things can do, that they didn't do that. I didn't try Manos, maybe that would have managed to do it.
Yeah. I tried Manos recently, and it's actually very impressive, so.
All right. So now let's move on to the first topic, and we will be discussing the revolution that we can actually see in the workforce now. So before the podcast, we looked up for some news related to companies. For example, Fiverr CEO. He said that every role, including his own, meaning the CEO role, will vanish unless people master AI. Then Shopify CEO said that they are not allowed to hire new people unless they prove that the work can't be done by the agents. And just last week, Microsoft announced they will let go over 6,000 people in different roles. So there will be huge changes in the workforce. But if we look at those statements from Fiverr or Shopify, so Taavi, I want to ask this to you. Do you see this like a PR stunt, basically? Or is it actually a really clear signal that tech founders are genuinely trying to redesign their organization and try to actually build on the automation?
I think there's a third option as well. So if you look at Fiverr, for example, I think that came out of fear. Because if you look at Fiverr's business model, it's literally what AI is going to replace. And the other companies as well, they're either very deeply involved in AI or AI is threatening their business model a lot. So I think for the time being, I think it's companies who fear it are making these types of things that, hey, this technology will disrupt us so hard, let's jump in front of the disruption and do it first. Whether they succeed or not, we'll see. I mean, a couple of companies have already rolled this back and then hiring again because it didn't go so good. But at the same time, that's a learning experience on its own, right? Few companies can say that they've tried this, failed, and tried again. So the companies that are going to go through this life cycle loop in the beginning will be most likely the companies that will adopt it in a good way as well. So, but coming back to the second part of the question, what are the kind of skill sets needed? I think it's people have to start thinking more like architects and less like tools. So they have something at their fingertips which is so powerful, but they have to be able to tell that tool what to do, basically. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about these bold statements that we have heard leaders come up with, do you think that this motivates the employees, or does it actually bring that fear and resistance? I might go to Luukas for that. And maybe coming from that perspective, what might bring that healthy adaptation to these organizations?
Well, let's just start, first of all, with the question of, well, what do we actually think is going to happen? And the real keyword here is, this is a bit of a mouthful, epistemic humility. Because the fact of the matter is, if you ask a panel of experts what's actually going to happen with the future of work 5, 10 more years, no one knows. And there's a case to be made that AI creates more employment, Jevons paradox, the idea that actually we have all these complementary human skills. But this could be a different enough technology to previous rounds of digitization or industrial technology that it's a completely different dynamic. And the other thing is the time dilation, right? It may turn out that in 5 years, very little happens, but in 50 years, it's a massive change. Given that, there are a few things that we can be sure about. I think the disruption is definitely going to be there. And it's not necessarily useful for an individual actor or even a country to think about the aggregate question of how much employment there is for humanity, because if you have a lot of disruption, then that can create a lot of distributional shifts from one industry to another. So maybe jobs will leave some traditional service industries and go into tech, also from one geography to another. I mean, think about business process outsourcing. That's something where China has basically had almost no role globally, in part because of the language barriers, also trust barriers. But if that becomes more software defined, China could be more of a business process outsourcing hub, in a sense, because it's Chinese software companies, than India. Which means that at the level of an individual organization, you certainly have to be ready for it. Now, what works? That's really tough. I mean, it depends a lot on the company, right? I think if you are a lean, mean tech company, you 100% should be going for the somewhat frightening message, because it's a selection mechanism. And if you need to turn through people quickly and you have to really find the talent that's ready for that growth curve, I think that's the right approach. Now, for conservative and slower organizations where, frankly, you have to find a way to bring everyone along, that could be a big corporation, that could be a lot of governments, it probably has to be a bit softer. But I also want to challenge the notion that it's only top-down. It's the boss is saying you must do this facing resistance. Because if we actually look at what's happening in big organizations, it's the other way around. We see people who want to use this, and the CEOs may also say that's great, or the top leaders, but the organizational structures and the rules are getting in the way. So you have all this sort of permissionless AI use, which it has plenty of risks, right? If you stick corporate information into a cloud-based commercial, sort of solution that's your private account, that's not the best information security practice, and you might be training the next round of ChatGPT or Gemini on your corporate sensitive data. I think we should also think about how you actually warmly encourage the bottom-up innovation to happen. What the right messaging is, I would ultimately say that you should use data, and you should use the practices of how you do things internet era. So A/B test it, try it out, see what works with your culture and your employees.
And maybe just to add on top of that, so far workforce skills have always changed. That's been perfectly normal, right? These days it's just a little bit more unpredictable and faster. There's no sure thing anymore. 5 years ago, software development, that's a very solid career choice. These days, well, not so much anymore, right?
But this means that we have to also think about reskilling. So a lot of the jobs that we have now will be changing. But what do you think, who should be responsible for the reskilling? So we talked about the companies, but maybe it should be like a state's obligation through some kind of subsidies, or maybe every individual should stand for themselves and pay for it themselves. Maybe Luukas, you want to answer that?
So we're in a fascinating moment when it comes to the impact of AI and productivity. Because if we look at the individual level productivity, we already see a massive sort of effect from AI. We all know that in our personal work, we can feel that effect. We have data from various types of occupations where people who use AI are either faster or more productive, by 20, 30, 40%, which if you consider that productivity growth is usually 1 or 2% a year, is a pretty big leap. But we don't see that productivity yet at the level of teams and larger organizations. And the reason that's important is that the skilling that individuals have to do and the skilling that organizations have to do is actually different in nature. On the individual level, there's a lot of familiarity with the tools we need to have. There's thinking through, what our work is. But organizations actually have to think about how culture changes, how teams function, and they can't delegate that downwards. What about the national responsibility, right? That's what ultimately we're getting to. I like that Estonia has taken this view that the education system needs to be, in effect, AI first, and we might talk about that later. So the parts of the thing that sort of government is anyways responsible for, education at a primary, secondary, university level, to some extent, 100%. How much should the government do in terms of the organizational reskilling? I don't know. Because I think the policy question that's really uncomfortable, that's raised by the effect of AI on industries, is that the companies that were productive and successful today and yesterday may not be best set up to be successful tomorrow. And if we look at change dynamics, it's tough to sort of transform yourself. And we're going to have the idea not of AI first, but AI-only organizations, maybe even. There's some interesting essays on that, competing. But certainly we're going to have born AI startups, and they're already running circles around even older tech companies and startups. And you'll have some of the big incumbents that make that leap well. And then you get into the question of, well, how easy is it for the new guys to displace the old ones? And that becomes this question of, well, how much does the government policy protect the incumbents? And I think that's actually the hardest question. Are governments going to, when companies start losing productivity, start losing ground, especially when they're losing ground to companies in other countries or other geographies, are they going to create protectionist barriers in the same way that right now we are applying massive tariffs to Chinese electric vehicles? Or are they going to let their companies fail? Now, you might gather from my comments that my predisposition is to let the companies fail, because you actually want to have that process of creative destruction. But it's also not quite so straightforward, right? And I think it's a more complicated argument. So that's going to be the tough argument for governments is do we let the companies fail, and then how much do we help, and where do we help? Do we help at the company level, the individual level?
And we already discussed also a little bit about the changes of the skill sets that employees need. And Microsoft just recently came out with the Work Trend Index. And they were talking about, of course, we know the 2025, the buzzword is AI agents. And there was a word brought out, which was agent boss, meaning that these employees need to now start learning about how to kind of guide this small army of co-workers, AI agents, right? And maybe, Taavi, you can also being just recently coming back from US, maybe you have already seen some of the skills that we need to have in order to understand the AI agents concept in general, and then also how to manage then one day and to be an agent boss.
So there's two things. The first thing is that, yeah, very commonly people talk about this agent boss level, but also it can happen the other way around, so that the agent becomes the boss. This is very common in, not very common, but it's more and more common these days in software development particularly, where it's actually better to have a CTO as an agent and employees work as software developers underneath that. So I think at this point in time, no one's going to know what's going to happen there. It's basically a free-for-all, but the agents are coming essentially. If you look at the skills and kind of job titles and stuff like that, traditional job titles stay the same mostly, but what's underneath is changing. A good example of this is UX and UI design, for example. Traditionally, UX, UI design is simple. Your website, pretty colors, all that type of stuff. Versus now, if you need to design UX for a conversation, that's a completely different skill set. But that is exactly where, if you want to build some sort of customer service chatbot for your company, is needed from a UX point of view. And this is actually happening across the board. I mean, you have completely new things like basically agent managers who make sure that every agent is doing the correct thing, that they are not going off the rails, that they are not creating financial fraud, for example, because another interesting topic is agents being able to purchase stuff for themselves as well. Right now, if you want an agent to build you a website, you have to basically do all the integrations and add the payments for the APIs yourself. But in the future, they will be able to buy stuff as well. And that's a completely new thing, and that needs KYC or KYA, know your agent type of things, and it can get quite difficult. But yeah, it is changing, but the roles stay the same, but what's underneath the roles basically changes.
And the website that you kind of mentioned, the conversational part of this, understanding that in the background we have metadata that needs to be, fine-tuned for the agents to be able to receive that information and go through these autonomous steps, right? It's a whole another shift that needs to be happen, and understanding on a root level as well why this is needed.
In websites in particular, it's going to be a completely different thing. I mean, right now we're talking about SEO, right? How visible your website is. And in the future, we might talk about how visible your company is inside a large language model. But that's a different rabbit hole that I don't think we should get into here.
Yeah, I want to go back to the software development side, because you said that the roles mostly are the same. But if we look at LinkedIn and what kind of job applications pop up there, I have to read them. So you have like AI prompt engineer, which is kind of reasonable. You have model ops lead. You have synthetic data designer. So all sorts of different roles emerging. Can you share, like, from your own point of perspective, have you hired some kind of these roles, or what kind of new roles you see, like, in your own field of work?
Not yet. So the whole prompt engineering side of things tends to be with companies who are mainly focused on working with LLMs in particular, or they have some sort of LLM product, that they need to build. So far, I'm still working with regular software developers that are just focused on AI, essentially. That might change, because the different roles that come in maintenance side of things, not when you build it. It's when you put it live and you need to make sure it's working properly and it's not, behaving in a bad way. LLM testing is something that is very, 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 interesting, and most likely will become a big topic, because how do you make an LLM behave exactly the way you want is kind of difficult, because, well, it's a neural network, right? So Me personally, I haven't seen any, or I haven't hired any new types. I've seen a lot of these prompt engineering job applications, but at the same time, I've actually talked to a company recently who hired 2 prompt engineers. And when I asked the CEO of that company, I said, "What is a prompt engineer? Can you tell me?" He said, "Oh, it's a software developer." Well, okay. I mean, cool.
Do you want to add something, Lukas?
Yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts, right? The best prompt engineering, so far the data has just come from people with deep domain-specific knowledge. Because they really and we have all this interesting data on which sort of skills profiles AI makes more productive, and it's the least skilled, because it just like, it knows so much more, and then it's the very most skilled, because the most skilled know exactly where there is knowledge AI can draw on, where there isn't, they have that mental map. Again, we'll see if that stays that way. A couple things you said that were interesting. When we talked about AI bosses, that's not entirely new. I mean, if you are an Uber driver, or a Bolt driver, or a Volt or a Bolt delivery person, you already today effectively have an algorithm that's your boss. And so I think the question is not, will we have AI bosses, but what percentage of our work will be covered by that? And I'll just report on how I've set my own AI boss up, which is I sort of throw a lot of my daily plans and everything into an AI, and I kind of let it tell me what to do and reflect on whether I'm meeting my goals and so on. What I haven't done yet, but it's on my to-do list, is to hook it up to one of these new sort of wearables that basically record everything you're doing in a day, like the limitless pendant, and take what I did in my day and my week, run that against what my health goals, my professional goals, my social goals, my family goals are, and be a super aware personal coach. So in a sense, it's a kind of, boss for your life. I don't really like the limitless pendant sort of data protection approach, so I still have to work through that. But it's clear that like a shift is going to happen. And again, epistemic humility, exactly where we land, no one knows yet.
Mm-hmm. I think let's jump into the next theme that we had, the global AI race, and coming from the geopolitics side of things. Understanding Donald Trump doing many different changes in the regulations, and just recently, changing the Biden's era regulations just to move faster onwards with the innovation. And Biden's era time, there was a strong emphasis on the AI safety, transparency, and the risk mitigation. But now, as Donald Trump is taking this, leap of faith at the same time, does this shift set the new global benchmark that, the nations need to move fast, skip the guardrails, and maybe going into what might be the risks behind it? And I will direct that to Lukas, to you, maybe.
So look, when people talk about AI regulation, there's this mistaken notion that the stuff that's called AI regulation is actually what we're talking about. Those sort of titular AI regulations, the Biden-era safety rules, the AI Act in the EU, they make up a tiny percentage of the regulation you have to think about when you're doing AI, because it's all the regulation we have, all the use case regulation, all the safety standards in any area, right? So if you're doing AI in healthcare, it's all of the existing healthcare rules. So what the Trump administration has already done is they have basically removed some of the safety rules and transparency requirements, similar to what the AI Act says, for now. The bigger question is what's going to happen with this broader deregulatory agenda. So there's been a request for information that David Sachs put out. He's the AI czar in the Trump administration, on what other rules could be simplified and changed. They've got 9,000 submissions to that request for information. They've basically promised a big strategy in September or October. That is really where the meat's going to be, because of sort of the model testing stuff that affects a couple companies, a couple applications. But the question is the entire big, ship of all the regulations that any modern society has. Like, how do we start changing those? And I don't know if the U.S. is going to move faster or slower on that. Just an interesting case in point. The Trump administration fired, I think like half the people at the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, that were doing health approvals. So that has massively slowed down drug approvals. And you had all these people doing health tech in the US saying, Trump is going to deregulate, it's going to be great. But actually deregulation, very rarely you're going to get rid of all the rules. You still have processes, safety, et cetera. And so if you get rid of the capacity, you can shoot yourself in the foot. So I think the marathon is to update the entire sort of process of how governments do regulation, which is not bad. I mean, we have regulations because we care about all sorts of public good, from clean water and air to, fair labor and, safety in cars and whatever. Like, that entire megastructure, who will be better at changing it? And that's a question of political will and capacity. And I'm not sure right now that the US is moving faster than Europe. Europe has lots of its own challenges that have been talked about a lot this week. But I think that is the thing you should be looking at when you ask who's doing what on AI regulation. Because AI regulation is very specifically for the model trainers, it's really important. For these potential safeguards, for AGI or ASI, it's very important. But it's not the nuts and bolts that most people doing new applications or companies with AI are actually going to spend most of the time working with.
Mm-hmm.
I think when it comes to the US, being freer than Europe from an AI point of view, I think the US has a better PR agent, first and foremost. Secondly, I think one thing that will come very quickly when it comes to regulation is that the amount of AI fraud and stuff like that is going to explode when you reduce regulation. So it might be a situation where right now, they will have very little regulation, but there will be just so much demand for regulation because society will be messed up with all these new fraud bots and stuff like that, which will be hyper personal, speak in your own voice, your mother's voice, whatever. And then eventually it will go down to the same level across the world. Maybe not in China and Russia.
And maybe, we're always used to asking, well, US versus Europe. And the answer on which of the large economies move faster and do more interesting things, maybe none of the above. China, obviously. India, very optimistic on AI. UAE and the Gulf region as a whole is really trying to turn itself into an economic hub. And so we may very well be in a situation in 2 or 3 years where collectively the US and Europe are both looking at the rest of the world and doing a lot of regulatory copying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you look at the top open source large language models, most of them are Chinese at the moment.
Mm-hmm. True.
Okay, but Taavi, I want to ask you, we are recording a podcast in Latitude 59. There are a lot of founders here. You yourself are a founder. So founders really often look at the US when they want to find their first customers, finding capital. So do you think this deregulation helps that? So you were in the US, I'm sure you maybe talked to founders there. Do they see this as a positive sign, the possibility, maybe more like European startups should focus on the US now?
So the question is that, is it easier to fundraise with an AI startup in the US versus Europe?
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely the vibe I'm getting that European regulation is a problem for investors, even problem for founders, and the mindset of, you need to go to the US before you raise is quite high there, basically. Mm-hmm. For the founders in the US, what I'm seeing is that growth isn't as expected compared to that freedom as well. So they're not all growing at the level of OpenAI or other companies as well. So it's definitely the vibe I'm getting there.
Yeah, and just to add to this, when I speak to the interesting European AI founders I know, they will just say, if I were doing this in the US, I'd have 10 times more money. No question about it.
But that's most founders.
True. That's not AI. I mean, that's fair. That is not AI specific, right? These are infrastructural issues that predate the last couple of years.
So the key question is, if we just want the money, we can go there, but the overall deregulation has a lot of negative influences.
I don't want to say that. Look, I mean, let's not focus on the regulation. It's the dynamism of the U.S. corporate economy, the speed with which companies adopt new technology. So it's not just because of money or regulations, primarily because that's where customers are, that you go to the U.S. And again, it varies by market. So consumer markets, it's because it's a single consolidated consumer markets. A lot of B2B markets, it's really because of the level of ambition of the customer. And you will also find pockets where that's not true, where there's a better B2B market in Europe. So you can't make one big generalization. And of course, the third category is public sector market, which, governments make up a third of GDP. And again, there's not a single simple answer, but there's certainly a lot of sort of either public sector or highly regulated public sector influenced markets where we could say that the market's a lot worse in the US, either because the buying's really fragmented, you have a lot of decentralization in the US, or there's regulatory stuff in whatever area. So behind that generalization that the US is better, there's a very granular landscape where, like, for your company and your thing, it may completely be the opposite picture.
And then one thing that I actually found was kind of the opposite. When European founders say they want to go to the US, I met with a really cool startup there who was also building one of these general agents, Manus type of things. And I asked him, hey, when can I have this in Europe? And he said, oh, I'm not coming to Europe anytime soon. The regulation is going to kill me. I was like, wow, okay, that's new.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring out the next topic about Trump's, influence on the AI landscape, and that's connected to the tariffs that we saw, which were exposed in May. And there were several trading partners who got the hindering and influence: China, Mexico, European Union, and from the founder's perspective, the GPU tariff swung from like 10% up to 145 or something like that. And that brings a lot of risks to these founders. And maybe you can bring out some of the strategies that the startups or companies you can handle these big jumps that might happen when it comes to costs of these.
Sure. Well, I mean, for startup founders, adapt. I mean, the startup founders are very resilient beings, and whenever these types of barriers arise, they tend to overcome it, right? A good example of this is that tariffs and kind of restrictions on AI chips is nothing new. The reason DeepSeek exists and is better than anything on the west side of the world in certain things, especially in speed, is because they had to rewrite some very low-level code because they couldn't get access to chips, basically. Mm-hmm. So there are ways around this. So when it comes to actually chips and manufacturing of them, NVIDIA in particular, I mean, it is a monopoly. There's no denying that, essentially. Yep. There is no real workaround other than, hoard it as much as possible in Europe. I mean, honestly, what are you going to do? Invent your own chip?
Well,
maybe.
So, first of all, just an empirical question. Do you still, I don't know if you've looked at the Gemini stuff that came out this week.
Yes.
Do you still stand by DeepSeek being faster? Or?
No. I was just using it as an example because that's what happened back then.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the Chinese are trying to do. I mean, we have now plenty of examples of China being frozen out of a market. Look at what the US did around Android and software for mobiles and chips for mobile devices. And the import substitution that was forced upon them, it maybe hasn't caught up to 100% of the capacity from the US competitors, but it's, at 90%.
Yeah.
And I think this is the open question. Like, there's nothing like there's no unique fundamental structural advantage that NVIDIA has that prevents someone from catching up. They've got a lot of lead time, a lot of smart people, some proprietary methods. The question is SMIC a year, a decade, how far are they behind?
Yeah, I mean, NVIDIA is, the chips that NVIDIA has built, I mean, if we talk about creating a competitor for a company like NVIDIA, they don't manufacture the chips, right? TSMC does. But what NVIDIA has is a software stack. So it's kind of the same way as Apple's ecosystem, right? Once you buy into that, development of an AI application is 15 times faster than if you started from scratch using NVIDIA's tools. That's the problem. You can even build the chips, but no one's going to use them because you can still get 15 times faster products by using NVIDIA stuff. Building the software stack along with that, now that's a completely different and much more expensive task.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I want to go back to the macro level, and I know, Luukas, you for sure want to answer that because we talked about it in the beginning also. So how does this tariffs on, tariffs off, because we know they made an agreement with China and different countries the US made. So how does this influence the other big countries? Because, let's focus on Europe for a second. So Europe is trying to build or saying that we want to build those huge gigafactories or what they were called. So we didn't have a possibility before, but maybe this tariffs gives us a leverage here somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just tariffs. It's the sort of tariffs on or off, export restrictions on or off, NATO on or off. It's a sort of broad uncertainty. I mean, China, in a sense, is the easy question just to answer quickly because they're just going to dig into having full stack everything. And that's not new, but this just gives them more reasons to do it. And then the question for Europe becomes, do we try and do a full stack Europe everything, or do we focus? My worry is that we have a lot of people in Brussels, in Paris, in Berlin, who want to do the sort of Europe full stack everything, and don't necessarily realize just how expensive that is. I mean, if you kind of think like full stack everything, mineral supply chain, hyperscalers, and you go through that all, and you think about just the sort of capacity, the like physical infrastructure, the number of people that you need to have these competitors, we'd be talking about several $100 billion, maybe more, of additional spending. It's not ultimately all public spending, but probably to jumpstart it's public spending that you have to find from somewhere. That's several percentage points of GDP that you just basically have to take in debt. So that's not realistic. And then the question becomes, what do we focus on? What are the leverage points? Either where we already have a leverage point and we want to make that stronger. So we do have, at the very beginning of the chips pipeline, before anything else happens, we've got ASML and we've got their whole supply chain around them, which is European companies. How do you strengthen that, build that out so you also have some leverage in these trade conflicts? And then on the flip side, around the sort of frontier developments, both of models, but also of use cases, can you get some advantages? I think it's less about completely replicating the US, but having enough leverage points so that that if you get into a trade war, you can punch back and you kind of have a bit mutually assured destruction. Because right now the problem is just that 90% of the really critical parts of the supply chain are asymmetrically in China or in the US, and there's just you can only do so much if you have ASML, and that's one company in one country. What should we be ready for? I mean, honestly, I don't have a definite prediction because it's scenarios, and none of the scenarios are off the table. The extreme scenario of China doesn't export anything to anyone, the US turns off all the hyperscalers. I think it's highly unlikely. Is it impossible? No. Is it more likely today than a year ago? Yes. Probably still talking in the 1-2% range there, but could happen. But definitely volatility, definitely uncertainty. There's the other bit is open source. I mean, the more I think if you ask me what should we be doing, part of it is not that we replicate China and the US, but we try and make the whole global landscape a little bit more resilient to these shocks. And the upside, the opportunity here is it's not like it's only a problem for Europe. It's a problem for Canada, for India, for all of Latin America. There's enough other people, enough money, enough economic heft that the rest of the world, if we find ways of doing stuff, can actually make ourselves much less dependent on and exposed to these shocks. But that's a really hard coordination thing that requires vision and collaboration and might also fail.
Yeah, very true. So before we go into our home yard, so talking about Estonia, I want to step a little bit further. So you are working closely with Ukraine and supporting their AI initiatives and digitalization there. So how do you see all of this macroeconomic situation influence them? Do they have a better possibilities than Europe and and Estonia maybe?
I mean, look, in the grand scheme, Ukraine is part of Europe, right? And Ukraine aims to be, and I think will be, a member of the European Union within the next few years. Mm-hmm. So there's no fundamental, difference there. And the flip side, of course, is also Ukraine's an asset for Europe, a huge talent asset. The thing that's driven Ukraine for the last couple of years has been the adversity they're in. So the story, of course, is really crappy situation. Being invaded, but also, frankly, before the war, the crappy situation of being one of the poorest countries in Europe, governance problems and so on. But really impressive reactions of innovation to those situations. So from 2019 to 22, of everything that Ukraine's done in GovTech, how they launched their national app, and then, of course, from 22 onwards, the whole story with drones, AI and warfare, they've set up a kind of a machine that takes shitty situations and then applies, all the things we know from the startup playbook, right, but also with government and the newest technologies to do really cool new applied innovation. So
can I ask you a question about, so you probably know more about this, but so we talked about tariffs and access to technologies. What about Ukraine? I mean, do they have access to the newest stuff? Do they have access to...
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at the sort of export restrictions that were announced at the very end of the Biden administration, Ukraine was in the same bucket as Estonia, which is a worse bucket than some Western European countries. They generally do. I mean, obviously, they've gotten a whole lot of defense technology. They're not in the sort of trusted inner sanctum of the closest U.S. partners. And obviously, they, like every European country, is playing to the question, well, what happens if that gets cut off? But right now, I mean, what they've been really good at is when they have to building up domestic capacity. So I mean, the drone story, you know, at the start of the war, there were 5 drone companies in Ukraine. Today, there are 300. 95% of the drones they use are produced domestically, and they've been very good at building up the capacity to replace things that they can't get from China, and so on and so forth. So I'd say what Ukraine has is they have enough of the old industrial economy, you know, left, plus a really good layer of, you know, technology innovators, data people, that they can do the vertical integration, you know, better than a small country can, and faster than the countries in Europe that still have that. So, you know, those factors, those capabilities, are still present in Germany, they're still present in France, but the iteration speed in Ukraine is like 10x. So in that sense, like, Ukraine looks more like China in how fast they move and how vertically integrated they are, but with the caveat that there's, you know, 30 plus million Ukrainians in Ukraine as opposed to 1-point-something billion Chinese.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I want to really jump into the last section because there is many key points that I really want to hear from Taavi and Luukas. And we're going to go into the Estonian AI strategic playbook, which we might maybe come up today here. And we know about the Tiger Leap, which kind of gave the ground for the e-state that we currently have. And now fast forward to 2025, we have that AI leap in schools, and maybe that's the first step. And I would like to maybe, Taavi, for you to go into what might be our next step, what Estonia should take to kind of compete or stay ahead in this global AI race.
Okay, so look, I would love for Estonia to build the next NVIDIA or the next OpenAI. But that's not happening in 2026, I think. There's not enough resources or you know, universities to cover all that need. I think Estonia should stick to, there's 2 things. I think Estonia should stick to what we've always been good at. One of them is testing new ideas quickly and expanding them. So I think we've been talking about regulation a little bit, but I think Estonia should become a AI governance sandbox, somewhere where you could test crazy ideas quickly and validate whether they work in society and potentially expand them to other places. This has worked. I mean, this has always been the case for startups in Estonia, right? That's why we have such a booming startup ecosystem. Is that it's a small market, the test, but it's very similar to other countries, even the US to some extent. The second thing is, if we look at things like the Tiger Leap, I mean, one thing why it was successful was because they initiated the product, but the program. But the other thing is infrastructure. We built infrastructure to actually have internet in schools and places like that. And I think one thing that Estonia is sincerely lacking right now is AI infrastructure. We don't have enough data centers, we don't have enough GPUs, we don't have enough power. And that's something where, if we want to succeed in AI, we should definitely put more effort into.
And what might be the first steps to, you know, building an infrastructure? That's a whole another topic. But what would be, because yesterday we had another podcast here, which was covering the Europeans' kind of steps that we can make in order to build that infrastructure. But what Estonia can do for, you know, for my small head, I'm like that. I cannot fathom what might be the steps, but
I think that there's a lot of things that is kind of out of my wheelhouse and more into Luukas's maybe, related to how do we get into like a better tier of tariffs so that we're not in the same place as Ukraine in terms of where we can buy AI chips and stuff like that.
Well, look, before we get to the policies, let me ask you a kind of technical operational question on the infrastructure. Because I think the easy answer is, well, that's not a specifically Estonian problem because we have a single market for energy, and, you know, it doesn't really matter whether the data center is in Huru or in Kajaani. You know, there's some like latency issues for some things. But let me ask, like, thinking operationally, technically, do you agree with that? Or like, where are the places where it actually matters for the infrastructure that's physically in Estonia, and where is, like, it doesn't really matter if it's here or Finland or Sweden or Latvia?
So I think with how it's going with open source, or to be more precise, open weight models at the moment, everybody will be running their own stuff in the future. There will be open AIs that will have, you know, individuals will still use their services, but large companies will have their own things. in that sense, there is a need for local processing, for local storage, for local power. And sometimes it's justified to have that, but sometimes it's just a kind of warm feeling that I know where my data is and I know where it's processed. And then there are things which are government military use which need to be located there. Whether or not that can be in Estonia and doesn't have to, for example, can Finland stuff be in Estonia? Yes, it can. Can the UK stuff be in Estonia? Different question. So it depends a bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing, like, where we have to get granular on what we mean by local. And, even for the sensitive government stuff, I mean, not easy, but not impossible to say we trust the Latvians as much as we trust ourselves. So, but there is probably stuff where actually, like, you do have to have super local infrastructure. Clearly, the communications infrastructure is going to matter for all of that. So 5G and not just, the binaries at 4 or 5G, but how good is it? Open question of what satellites can do. But yeah, I think the infrastructure picture is different to what it was in the 90s.
Definitely.
But we do have some kind of leverage, we don't have like large AI models, but we have data. So we have quite high digitalization. We have a lot of AI use cases already done in the government, so which we all also share, like to the foreigners when they come here. We have actually like good regulation for the startup. So do we have like a good grounding place to start with the AI revolution here?
Look, I think what Taavi said is right, which is what we have been good at is the application of technology and figuring out the different factors, right? I mean, if you think about Tiger Leap 1, it was really about creating a funnel. Mm-hmm. And we were the first ones to create a whole of nation funnel, which is like not just all the young people. That was formerly the Tiger Leap was about schools, but more broadly, to think about all the skilling at every level of society. Like we created the biggest funnel proportionally of any country early on. And just, mathematically, you end up having more people who have these skills, who think about it. You end up, doing something like Jan and Janos and Sten doing something like Skype, before other countries are doing that. That's one bit. When you talk about, the data and the regulation, you can't make a generalization. It is use case specific. We certainly have better data and better organized and higher quality data and more existing automation than most countries. But there's some caveats, right? The first is that we have less of it in aggregate. We're also very used to, in the public sector use cases, thinking of small data, structured data with legal value, not taking the messy bucket. And in a sense, we don't actually have the ecosystem skill to deal with messy, unstructured data. Because like in countries that don't have the quality of automation and public services we have, that only have the poor, messy, unstructured data, they've been doing ML on that to get something out of it, because they haven't been able to do the sort of deterministic automation we've done. And so we have to bulk up our skills on that a bit. I think it's not any particular factor endowment. Like, we have the data, we have the people, we have the regulation. It's actually this iterative process of how quickly are we going to listen to what we hear from the innovators and then change the environment to facilitate that. So you go back to the, 10 years ago, the case of, we had permissive regulation on ride sharing before other countries in Europe did. And the 4G infrastructure is like Bolt. I mean, not only, obviously it happened because had some great founders, but that was one of the things that made it possible for Bolt to happen here. Do we repeat that? And that's ultimately a question to, politics, the political system, and so on. And, frankly, the ambition of the founders, because upstream of all the regulations being right, you actually have to have the people building the companies and the use cases. You could do the world's best regulatory environment. And if you don't have someone who then is going to come and build a product or a service, nothing's going to happen.
And just to add on top of that, I think we also should kind of understand that we have the data, yes, but the amount of data we have is incredibly small, right? There's something called a bitter lesson in AI, which says that huge amounts of messy data is tons more better than a very clean small data set to teach an AI model. And that's exactly what we have. We have created very small, very good data sets versus we need to have that huge amount of data, which we don't. So in that sense, that is something that I don't consider a kind of an advantage in Estonia.
what I'm hearing is that we have like bits and pieces everywhere, so we need good cooperation between the government, between businesses, and all of those innovators and people who are really eager to be part of it.
Yeah, but the good cooperation is still upstream of the vision and the ambition. Because like cooperation is reactive to someone owning it. Like if everybody's just super cooperative and friendly and they all get together at the meetups and they all want to help each other, but no one wants to do something big and bold, then we'll just all have nice meetups and saunas.
Yeah.
If we're talking about the vision, I would like to give you a challenge. If you could paint the headline you would like to read in 2026, Estonia becomes Europe's first, or whatever it might be. You can complete that sentence and what you would like to see as the first kind of action towards it. How could we position ourselves?
I'm going to throw a bunch at you because I don't think it's about one, right?
Yep.
Like we have to go for volume. We have to do a pipeline. We have to experiment, and a bunch of these things are going to fail. So I'm just going to start. Riffing. Taavi, jump in. You guys jump in. Let's see if we can get a list together. So I'm going to start off with a few. First country to have fully automated transcription of doctor-patient and nurse-patient conversations going into the medical records. First country to have full, AI-only autonomous companies have legal status equivalent to companies with humans on the board. First company to, we're already working on to have everyone in the school system using AI. And if the experiment goes well in the next year, let's expand that to primary education. First country to have university courses taught by AI, or at least TA'd fully by AI. All right, that's 4 or 5. Your turn.
How about first country that has a first AI politician?
AI minister. I think the UAE already has an AI minister.
UK does.
Okay, well that goes. Mine goes down the drain then.
But we could have first AI member of parliament, although that's probably not till 2027.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good one. Any more?
No, I mean, my thing was around all of the legislation basically. So I'm hoping the first country to kind of have kind of this AI sandbox. So to be honest, these days predictions like that don't really work. So we don't know what it's going to be, right?
True.
Yeah, I want to add to that because as working with corporations, the legislation and all the regulation, it's super difficult for them. Yeah. And all of the time that they have to wait for the government or different institutions to figure out or decide what they want to do and what they want to ask. Basically, we know that the AI Act is already in implementation, but we don't know what to do still. So it would be nice if Estonia would be the first one to actually figure it out and allow the companies to do it in a more easier or more simple way. I
mean, it happened with GDPR a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Because Estonia adopted GDPR in full vanilla form. If you say to another company that, we adopted the same GDPR in Estonia, then it's, okay, understood. That's fine.
Mm-hmm. True.
But I think the sandboxing it's not going to be the AI sandboxing. It's going to be AI in sector X. It's going to be, the permissive rules in healthcare. Permissive rules. We're fairly permissive already, but we could be a lot more permissive when it comes to transport and autonomous vehicles. I'm going to pick on you. First country to allow AI-driven automatic switching of energy, dynamic switching of energy providers.
How about?
Yeah.
How about first country to have access to AI as a human right?
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I mean, from my perspective, the AI Act and the AI Office working on all the regulations, and us, of course, having to implement the sandbox system as all of the European level countries need. Somehow moving fast enough to have that whole setup first up and running due to their smallness that we have. So somehow being a forefront leader in the AI Act implementation and supporting the startups and the companies here just due to the network that we have set up for that. Yeah. But actually, I would like to raise one question to both of you. Because we all are here enthusiasts and our hands and feet are all in this landscape all the time. What might be the themes or the interest areas that you're currently most excited about and want to kind of move towards to? Because I know you were in the US. Most probably you noticed a lot of the different trends that are there. So maybe just bringing out your own interests here.
Sure, I'm very much into agents these days because as I mentioned before, every time I see a well-built, well-designed agent, it continues to impress me. It's funny because when OpenAI released ChatGPT, it seems like a very general thing. It's gone super broad, you could do anything, and now it's kind of going the opposite way of agents becoming super narrow and doing super narrow things. So for me, definitely, that's the case of trying to figure out what's the best agent out there. I'm definitely interested in how to give agents superpowers. So I mentioned giving agents the ability to buy things, but also create their user accounts, stuff like that. There are so many potential downfalls there, or pitfalls, like fraud and stuff like that, because you can make an agent behave like a person and all that type of thing. And I think even Sam Altman has gotten into the fact that you need to somehow be able to prove that you're not an agent on the internet as well, right? So that's something that I'm also kind of interested in at the moment.
I mean, on that last point, I think every country in the world that doesn't have EID figured out is going to have to do it really quickly, because sort of all the old-fashioned ways that in the US you kind of mitigated fraud or figured out that the person interacting with wasn't the fraudster in the other half of the world, they stopped working. My answer to Sandra's question is very boring, because I'm going to say agents also. Of course, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about agents ex-government. And not just sort of in a technical sense, but all the sort of functional layers of government, how government does regulation, how government does its public services. And like every one of those, the basic business model can change. In some places, it's going to be very similar to what happens in an enterprise, right? So, government UX is going to follow probably what the sort of interesting enterprise UX is doing. So initially just sort of making it more multimodal, more adapted to people, but over time, self-composition of services. We don't have to have a team get together and define our public services or, figure out what a life event is, because that can all kind of come together on the fly from the resources and the rules. But there are also areas where government can do pretty unique things. So how compliance and regulation works. It's not just a question of the agents or the AI reading the rules and the regulation, but actually writing it. We can set a high-level goal around health, environment, and let the AI figure out what the optimal rules are. Let it change it on the fly, because let's think about any area where the compliance is done by organizations. They're also going to be using agents, right? So let the agents of the polluters negotiate with the agents of the government on an overall optimal outcome. Any transfer can be done with micropayments, so you got to have those crypto rails next to it. And things could look very cool 5 or 10 years from now.
Just a really quick question to you before we have to wrap up here, since you're both really into agents. So what I see mostly are basically agentic workflows, not just like Manus or operator type. So when you can both answer, so when is the time you actually see that we can give control over to agents of our phone or our computer to actually do the stuff on their own?
Can you elaborate on that question?
To what
why
extent,
not now?
maybe,
Why?
Yeah, so maybe, for example, if I want to set up a new product for my company, and I will just ask the agent in my phone to go deeply into all of our documents, all of our previous discussions, put this material together, maybe prep for an investor talk, and put all this material together and can just check it up.
I'm going to have a bit of a cheeky answer here, is that you should be able to give over control to an agent when you know what you're doing. By that I mean...
So it depends on the person.
If you know exactly what that product launch should look like in an algorithmic way, you can have an AI agent do that. If you don't, it's going to be a mess.
So one of the things I think you're picking on is, or the thread you're pulling on is that when you automate something, you actually have to formalize it in a way you didn't before. Like any process, there's a huge amount of tacit knowledge in the background. If I say to someone, cook some eggs, there's a bunch of things they're doing in the background, like, get the butter, get the right pan, that has to be formalized. And it's the same thing when you're automating any process. And what we found with previous rounds of automations, we always, every time we discover a new layer of tacit knowledge we didn't even realize was going on there. the tricky thing with the agentic stuff is what's the reliability you need? You know, people say, okay, they're 90% or they're 95% reliable. That sounds pretty good. But it might actually be for some of the types of screw-ups that we want to avoid. Like, we actually need 5 nines. Because, like, dear agent, please don't give my credit card data and all my personal data to the first entity you're automatically interacting with that says, you know, give me root level access to their passwords. Like, I want to have 99.99999% reliability on that because it's a catastrophic breach. And this is also why, like, for all the really cool stuff, why aren't governments, why aren't mission critical companies doing this now? Because they're realizing that the level of reliability in terms of don't do really stupid stuff that fundamentally violate like the basic existential reason that your business or your process exists, like that has to be super reliable. Yeah. And if you ask me, like, when do we get to that level of reliability? It's a tough one. And I think we're going to play around for a couple of years with sort of humans on the loop, but where they like are enough on the loop that they still can kind of stop the processes before something catastrophic happens. And then people will start taking risks. And at some point, you know, the frameworks will be good enough and the risks will be small enough that we'll just kind of suddenly find ourselves having actually taken the humans out of the loop completely.
But I think for sure that we all understand that change is quite near, and it comes nearer every time when we talk about the AGI and all of that concept, which has been coming from 10 years to 2 years to even, you know, even closer.
Maybe being here already.
Yeah, exactly. But unfortunately, we have to wrap up. But thank you so much, Taavi and Luukas, for sharing your ideas. And definitely, if you want to hear more about the AIPowerment podcast, you can follow us on Spotify, on Apple Podcast, on YouTube. And thank you, Gerlin, for being with me here. And yeah, all for you. Have a lovely rest of the Latitude 59 startup event. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fun.
Täname Estonian Business Schooli, kes on meie ametlik tehniline partner ja pakub taskuhäälingute salvestamiseks professionaalset video- ja helistuudiot.